It's an honor to be a part of this gathering with our indigenous brothers of this part of the land. I want to say that despite of our color, don't let it separate us. We're all the indigenous peoples to some part of this earth. When we sit and we discuss our issues, it's similar. How can we work together to leave a legacy for the new generation to come? I think that is what all indigenous brothers and sisters should focus on. How can we leave a good legacy for our future indigenous to come? I'm enjoying St. Vincent, beautiful. This is my first visit here, lovely land. And God richly bless this land. Thank you.
Goedemiddag iedereen.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Excellency Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves, good afternoon, special good afternoon to you. And alle hoogwaardigheidsbekleders leaders hier in de zaal.
And all other notables and everyone in the room. Thank you.
Ik ben Theo Jubitana, Chief from Suriname, from Hollandse Kamp Village. En vanaf vorig jaar voorzitter van de Vereniging Inheemse Dorpshoofden in Suriname.
My name is Chief Theo Jubitana. I'm the village leader of the village Hollandse Kamp, and since last year the chairperson of the Association of Indigenous Village Leaders in Suriname.
Het is een eer voor mij om hier te zijn. Het is de eerste keer dat ik ook hier ben in St. Vincent. Even de delegatieleden voorstellen. Mevrouw Audrey Christian. Meneer Steven Petrucci, also chief van de Maroon People. En Max Ooft. Het is een eer voor ons vandaag hier te staan op het podium van St. Vincent met alle hoge gasten. Ik denk dat iedereen zich naar deze dag heeft geleefd om de conferentie te vieren hier in St. Vincent.
It's an honor for us to be here, to be with this gathering and all these very notable people. And it is for sure that all of you have lived up to this moment to be here for this great gathering.
In Suriname, van waar wij komen, heb 52 inheemse dorpen, meer dan 8 inheemse stammen en met een totale bevolking van 30.000 inheemse.
The indigenous peoples in Suriname, we are with 52 villages with more than 8 indigenous peoples and approximately 30,000 indigenous persons.
Voor de korte tijd dat ik hier ben, dat wij hier zijn, hebben we gezien de strijd die ook hier wordt gevoerd voor erkenning. Hier in Suriname is dat niet anders met inheemse. Eigenlijk overal ter wereld zijn inheemse in strijd voor hun rechten, dan voor hun land en voor een voortbestaan.
As we've seen here, our struggle is very similar. We are all struggling and fighting for our rights to be recognized and respected. Land rights and other issues are confronting us similarly in Suriname as well, what we've seen here and from our other delegates.
Als ik hier sta, dan voel ik me één met iedereen van Vincent. En ik groet ook namens alle inheemse van Suriname de mensen hier. Het is een warme klimaat, ook in Suriname. Ik wens u nog een heel fijne avond verder. We zitten te kijken en we zullen ook even mee genieten.
As we are here, we feel very united with everyone here. It's also a similar climate. We feel very much at home, and we look forward to this conference as well.
Oké, Sani Wese, dat is in het Arwax. Dank u wel. En Utambum, Sari Hawajiki.
I will ask you how you are doing in the Karinya or Kalinyago language. Yupa Dorpomang, Yupa, thank you.
Udah nowadays this na apa sih in the gitar from a good.
I'm also greeting you in my own language.
Me beriti takto me de gaso tide des in Srana da di abi ko 6 stama fu bus negre da in of den liba na drape me poko and of den standa na samaka.
In Suriname, we have the Maroons, also known by different names. There are 6 tribes, 6 peoples, different peoples of Maroons. And he is from the Saramaka tribe or nation or people, and that is one of the 6 on the Suriname River.
So, migitangi na aorgasan puro uno grabe ponja tide and mi wensi taki a orga sa edrai di uno ponja alasan kawakabung so that temigo baka mi kancari abus kopudisi di the family baka ganatay.
He's saying thank you for the opportunity to be here. Also very much of success for the organization of this event. We will bring back the messages that we get here to our peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our sisters and brothers from Dominica, Guyana, Suriname, and Belize. Do we have delegates from Trinidad and Tobago? Oh, sorry. Please forgive me. Please come forward, please. Please welcome her.
Good evening. Protocol having been established, I'll just extend a special greeting from Belize to the Honorable Prime Minister Gonzalo Mabugre from Belize. I bring greetings from Garifuna in Belize. There are 6 Garifuna communities in Belize, but Garinago can be found all over Belize, so we're from north to south. One of the desires for every Garifuna throughout the diaspora is to one day visit Yorome. Yorome is St. Vincent. This is where the Garifuna, we can call Yorome the birth of the Garifuna nation. It all started here, and when we were exiled, we were like kicked out from our homeland. And it is always a pleasant opportunity for any one of us to be back. And when we go back home, we're always questioned, what is it like? How are the people? And numerous questions. Do they still have the culture? Are they still talking Garifuna? So the exile might have one positive, if nothing else, the culture remained. If we had stayed, the culture would have been lost completely. We would just have been like in the history books. So because of the exile, we can now visit Rome, and we can help the girls here in retrieving what they have lost. It was so I had cold seed when I heard the anthem in Garifuna, and that's a start, right? So that there is hope. there is hope of preserving the language. You have dance, you have people now, you have an exchange where in the summer months you have Garifuna classes, you have drumming classes. Now that's a good way. Just imagine if the wishes of the colonizers were fulfilled. We would not be here. And so I bring greetings from our people, from your people, all over, because we're still indigenous, and we are here with pleasure. This is not my first visit here, and I'm always look forward to come back. It's like coming back home, right? Not to stay, but to come back and see what is left behind and what progress has been done. We are always willing to help and push forward, right? So don't see us as a threat. We are partners, we are brothers and sisters, and we are here to help, to preserve what you have lost. Thank you.
Please give another round of applause to all our delegates. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to invite the president of the Garifuna Heritage Foundation, Mr. David Darkey Williams, who is indeed a national treasure. Please welcome him.
Good afternoon, everyone. How I wish I could just stand here and ad-lib and ramble on, because there are so many things that I can say, I'd like to say, that is not written on the 2 pages that I have to read to you this afternoon. But this is a formal occasion, and I would stick to what is required of me. At this point, therefore, I would like to adopt the protocol that has been established, and I would also like to recognize among us the presence of Professor Velma Newton, who is sitting among the chiefs in the front. Professor Newton is the director of a UWI project called Impact Justice. And the other meeting that is happening simultaneously with this conference, that's why all the chiefs and other persons who are up here, they're here for that meeting. And through the Impact Justice project, headed by Professor Newton, all these people are in St. Vincent to partner with us on one hand and to help to move the process forward in terms of what happens with indigenous people across particularly the CARICOM region. So brothers and sisters, Professor Newton, once more, thank you very much. And we hope other partnerships will develop sometime in the future. At this point, let me extend a special welcome to every one of you sitting in this hall this afternoon. The Garifuna once dominated the island of St. Vincent in this part of the Caribbean, which we call the Eastern Caribbean. But today, Garifuna people now live displaced in many countries, particularly in Central America. They are there as a consequence of the 1797 forced removal from St. Vincent and the Grenadines by the British colonialists. The island of St. Vincent, known by the Garifuna as Yurume, is part of a wider Caribbean living legacy of indigenous peoples' presence. The presence, existence, and resistance to colonial imperatives within the Americas. It is on this island, now part of the multi-island state of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that the Garifuna nation, a nation of hybrid indigenous people created from the intermarriage between African and Kalinago people, was born right here on this small island. As the conflict between the British colonial powers and the indigenous Kalinago and Garifuna intensified over control of the lands in Yurume, the Kalinago and Garifuna people resisted through fierce guerrilla warfare. They resisted the might of the British military machinery for over a century. Nonetheless, in 1795, the Garifuna surrendered, and in 1797 were expelled by force. First, to the island of Balliceaux, which is now part of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and subsequently to the remote island of Roatan, off the coast of Honduras in Central America. The descendants of those 2,248 Garifuna persons who were expelled from Balliceaux to Central America, those descendants now number over 300,000, and they have never forgotten the brutal impact of that expulsion. The memory of the loss of their homeland still remains vivid and painful after more than 200 years. Those Garifuna descendants who mainly reside in Honduras and Belize and Guatemala and Nicaragua and the United States still consider Yurume their spiritual homeland, a place to which a pilgrimage must be made at any available opportunity. Yurume still resonates in songs and mournful laments in ceremonies practiced within the Garifuna culture, especially in relation to the celebrations honoring the ancestors. The central focus of this pain is the island of Balliceaux. Balliceaux is specially revered as a sacred place, as it was here that approximately 2,500 persons, 2,500 Garifuna people who were held in captivity died within a period of 6 months subsequent to their surrender to the British in 1795. In each of the countries where the Garifuna people reside, the challenge and the opportunities are great, and they differ from country to country. Nonetheless, the memory of the homeland Yurume is revered and still evokes very painful responses. This memory and the journey it symbolizes from the homeland to the diaspora is one that has not so sufficiently confronted. It has not been analyzed and brought closure collectively. In 2002, the United Nations, through its arm UNESCO, proclaimed the Garifuna heritage and culture as one of the intangible masterpieces of the heritage of mankind. In 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, commonly known as UNDRIP. That declaration was ratified by the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And in 2016, the American Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People was concluded by the Organization of American States. These documents seek to promote the rights of the indigenous people to all aspects of their heritage and culture, including protection of sacred sites, and may provide some new international impetus for implementing and designing cultural preservation programs. However, the national development priorities of governments or the domestic legal context and the legal rights of private citizens may impact the exercise of the rights granted under these international conventions. In addition, there needs to be properly documented information on the history, the archaeological research, and other baseline information required to ground a substantial project for cultural preservation of the island of Balliceaux. In this context, with that kind of background that I just outlined, the Garifuna Heritage Foundation is proud to host our 5th International Garifuna Conference. In 2012, we convened our first international conference. And that conference resulted in something which we call the Eurome Declaration, which specifically made a call for reparations for the Garifuna people. That's back in 2012. Since then, CARICOM has established a commission to secure reparations for native genocide and slavery. We have with us for this conference a collection of scholars and practitioners and cultural activists who have come to present on the following theme, which is the theme for this 5th International Garifuna Conference, and that theme is the island of Balliceaux, sacred lands or economic opportunity. It is our hope that these presentations and discussions and hopefully some declaration will provide a platform for action to be formulated. To our overseas guests, your participation in this conference is very important, so I would like to thank you once again for being here. And to all Vincentians, we hope that you will find the time to also participate in this conference, even if it's just for a very short time, and to participate in all the other events taking place around St. Vincent at this time. I would like to thank you for being here this afternoon and hope that you would enjoy the rest of the afternoon and be informed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Williams, for your remarks. We want to move straight into our next item, and it's a performance by a group that has, in 2013, got the award for Outstanding Performance in Dance. In 2004 and 2016, they became the KCCU National Dance Champions, and last year they were judged the winner for the best community group in the Best of St. Vincent's and the Grenadines 2017. This group is under the artistic direction of Miss Maxine Brown, and Miss Brown holds a Bachelor of Arts in Dance with honors and a Master of Arts in the Performing Arts Management. Ladies and gentlemen, we want to welcome the La Gracia Dance Company with presentation YANIQUE HUME. Please welcome the dancers.
Vincentians, Vincentians. The time is right for a Garifuna revival of Yurume's indigenous culture. We cannot afford to forget our culture. If we lose it, we lose our identity. And if we lose our identity, we will never ever know who we are. Who are we? Who are we? Who are we? Where do we come from? We need answers. And Yurume, yes, Yurume, this land of Chatoye, this land of Garifuna, we, Vincentians, need to reflect on what it means to be Garifuna. We need to talk Garifuna. Balliceaux! Live Garifuna. Dance. Dance to the rhythmic sound of our African and Kalinago ancestry. Our Garifuna heritage.
Thank you very much, La Gracia Dance Company. Please give them another round of applause. A splendid performance and strong message. May I invite the platform, we are welcoming you this afternoon, but may I invite you back on stage, please? Thank you. And perhaps this is an indication that Mr. Prime Minister, we need our National Performing Arts Center. But that's another discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure now to invite to the podium the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines to address this conference. Prime Minister.
Mr. Chairman, the chiefs and representatives of the indigenous people from across the region, very specially invited guests, the leadership of the foundation, and all other persons who are present here, the media, very much the members of the diplomatic corps. I inverted the protocol, and Jomo and Camilo and other persons who are here from Parliament. I'm very happy to be here this evening. It's a very important conference, and as always, we are hoping that there's not only education and conscientization concerning the Garifuna, Balliceaux, our history, but very much about a program of action for our future, because it's always important that we do not live in history. We learn from history in order for us to improve our lot and to do better than before, and to do the best what can possibly be done in all the circumstances. It's important, therefore, that we know and understand our history, but we do not live in it. Because if we live in it, the history can imprison us. We have to use the history to liberate us and to lift us higher. I think that's very important. From the standpoint of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we have done a lot of work locally and regionally and internationally. Dr. Williams, the president of the foundation, the Garifuna people here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, made reference to two important international declarations. One of them from UNESCO, in affirming a number of important cultural rights and to proclaim the Garifuna heritage and culture as one of the intangible masterpieces, one of the one of the constellations of nobility of the heritage of mankind. And we have to take that heritage. We have to utilize it for our own humanization. We can't just stay in it. And in 2007, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, we are one of 144 or thereabouts member states of the United Nations, which voted for this declaration at the General Assembly of the United Nations. Several countries abstained, some were absent, and a few opposed. I just want to remind us that our neighbor to the north, our big neighbor to the north, opposed this. Canada also opposed it. It is important that we pay attention as to who supports certain things and who oppose them. Because those same persons will seek to come to us, bramble us and divide us. But you know, a lot of times we don't learn. We take our cue from them. They have sought to divide us on all sorts of things historically. They sought to divide us on the grounds of nationality, class, ethnicity, culture, gender, and in that division, so long as monopoly capitalism retains its suzerainty, they're happy, they're pleased to make ourselves and our society better, and to do so through the prism, through the eyes of ourselves. And that we must not allow any people or any nation to set limits to our possibilities or to our imagination. And that imagination must be within our own interests. These are very straightforward truisms, but we tend to forget them. I want you in the Garifuna and indigenous communities across the region and across the world to take advantage of 6 countries which were recently elected: St. Lucia, Cuba, Venezuela, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. You must read up on the executive board of UNESCO. 58 members out of 192. That's the body which drives UNESCO. And we have important location in the authority structure. Just by the way, these 6 countries in the Caribbean defeated others for positions like Argentina and Chile and Colombia. So I just want to make that point, because we have to fight this matter on all fronts. Now, I want to talk about land and people, the Garifuna, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, but I want to ground it in the declaration. We need to read it and we need to study it. How many of you have read the declaration, the resolution adopted by the General Assembly with the declaration as the appendix? We mustn't be ashamed if we haven't read it. 2007, your government agreed to this and we ratified it. So too Dominica and Guyana and Suriname and Belize. And our guest lecturer or guest speaker is from Jamaica too. And Barbados, where she now lives. It has several limbs to the preamble, and it has 46 articles. In its preamble, relevance, it says, the General Assembly concerned that indigenous peoples have suffered from historic injustices as a result of, among other things, their colonization and dispossession of their lands, territories and resources, thus preventing them from exercising in particular their right to development in accordance with their own needs and interests. It addresses inside also the question of genocide. We begin to see where I'm coming in respect of reparations. This is international law, you know. This is not the only one. Jomo has studied the subject, Camilo does too. Worship, the magistrate, the Garifuna from St. Vincent and Grenadines and Belize, she studied it too. It says, very importantly, in Article 28, indigenous peoples have a right to redress. But what does redress mean? It means that where you have been wronged, those who have gone wrong, we have to put it right. That's what redress means, you know. I think they call it reparative justice, Jomo. That's what we call it. Indigenous peoples have the right to redress by means that can include restitution, or when this is not possible, because you may not be able to have restitution because so much time has passed with the land. Other people have it now. You can't get it back. And when this is not possible, just, fair, and equitable compensation for the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, and which have been confiscated, taken, occupied, used, or damaged without their free, prior, and informed consent. Second paragraph of Article 28. Unless otherwise freely agreed upon by the peoples concerned, compensation shall take the form of lands, territories, and resources, equal in quality, size, and legal status, or of monetary compensation or other appropriate redress. Well, it doesn't mean that the individual descendants of the Garifuna are going to line up with a calabash and get money. No, that's not what it means. What it means, and it is emphasized in the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and in that convention, it speaks to the identical question of recompense where, as a consequence of genocide or the taking of the lands or the retardation of development, that a legacy of underdevelopment has been left, and the reparatory justice is required to address the legacy of underdevelopment. And that is why there's a 10-point program, and it covers education and health, and it covers financing for development, covers all of these things to repair, to put us as far as is possible in a situation where we can prove ourselves. See why I begin by saying that we don't have to live there in the history. We are now. But we have to use our knowledge and our history and our contemplation. And those who haven't studied it, will tell you, you're onto a pipe dream. Ralph wasting the time. Jomo wasting the time. Hillary Beckles wasting the time. Camilo wasting the time. Everybody wasting the time. And some even tell you have to deduct from the assistance which you get from the European Union. A little money here and a little money there. Well, those are things which were voluntarily negotiated. We don't want to have a war with anybody. We want to have a proper conversation. And if that conversation does not yield appropriate results, we go to the International Court of Justice, which is where we go there. And it becomes international law. But this is what they are, we are signatory to this. We are signatory to the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and others. Now, what is the story about land and people, very briefly? Stop me when you want me to sit down here. I told him that we want to hear, people hear me a lot. We have to hear our sister who is coming to talk. talk with us about sacred lands. No. You'll get a lot of history, and I don't want to go into all the history of the Garifuna came about, or the Kalinago came about. When the British came in 1763, they found them. That's my starting point. Other sessions will tell you how they came. They're here in 1763. At the Treaty of Paris, they met us. They met St. Vincent and Grenadines here. Well, it was Uranian. That's what it was. Before that, all the land in this country was owned in common. Except for about 2,000 acres on the western side of the island, which the Kalinago and the Garifuna agreed for the French them to occupy on what we call nowadays a leasehold basis. Organized slavery as a system did not at that point exist. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, therefore, organized slavery came to it 100 and something years after Barbados, 100 and something years after St. Kitts. Maybe, and we had it for a shorter period of time. But the trade was up to 1807 and slavery up to 1838. Maybe that's what makes us, in some respect, a little different, how the Barbadians would respond to certain things than we ourselves. Maybe. Don't know. That has to be explored. But as soon as the British took charge of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, one of their first acts in 1764 was to declare that all the land belonged to the British Crown. At one stroke, even though they ain't controlling the land as a whole, they declare it that it belongs to them. They have established a legal basis for themselves because they're going to be here for the long haul. And then, between 1763 and let us say 1800, 5 years after Chateaubriand was killed, and 3 years or so after the great genocide against the Garifuna people and their deportation, exile, their transportation to Balliceaux and then their exile. St. Vincent's 133 square miles. It's 85,120 acres of land. The Grenadines is 17 square miles or 10,880 acres. Remember, you know, the people whom the British came and met here, they own the land in common. But by 1800, in 37 years, what does the history books tell us when you check out that the Kalinago and Garifuna people were practically quarantined on an allocated parcel of land of 238 acres in an inaccessible area in the northeast of St. Vincent. Because within that period, the fight was about land, you know. The fight was about who to rule you. But you come from where you come from, and you want my land. I have to fight you for it. You could call me fierce, you could call me warlike, you could call me whatever you want. Today in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, people kill one another for 100 square feet of land in a boundary, by the boundary. You hear me? And an acre is 44,000 something square feet. People kill for 100. So you don't want me to fight for my 85,120 acres. I don't want me to fight for 10,880 acres in the Grenadines, including Balliceaux. And remember this, that Britain ruled this country unbroken from 1763 until internal self-government in 1969 and formal independence in 1979. Save and except for a brief period of 4 years between 1779 and 1783, when the French temporarily dislodged British occupation and settlement. And bit by bit, over that period of time, they took away the land. I've been given an advance copy of Camilo's speech tomorrow, so I'm not going to traverse territory which he has in his speech. But how they did it is very interesting. In 1764, the British government granted to General Robert Monckton, a hero of the 7 Years' War, which brought about the end. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 brought that war to an end. He is the man who received the surrender from the French. For that, they gave him 4,000 acres on the windward side of the island. They give him between what is today Bayaboo and Stubbs. Bayaboo in the north and Stubbs in the south. And included extending inland to the headwaters of the rivers flowing from the Mesopotamia Valley. Over 400 acres of the land. When you all came in at Argyle, the airport, that include part of the land they gave Monckton. They didn't give him land in London, Oxford, nor Cambridge. They gave him between Bayaboo and Stubbs. 4,000 acres. Monckton didn't set foot here, you know, to take the land. He sold it for 30,000 pounds sterling. How much does that worth today? Using a factor of about 900, that's 27 million pounds, or over $100 million Eastern Caribbean today. The reason why I use a factor of 900, remember this is 1763. If you read Professor Draper of the University College of London, In 1833, he equated the values as 829, by a factor of 829. So if you go back as far as 1763, 1764, you will get about 900. You may dispute the factor by about 5 or 10, but it's in that ballpark. Then the British auctioned off 20,538 acres. Out of that money, the British Treasury got 162,854 pounds. The equivalent today is 146.59 million pounds, or $612 million Eastern Caribbean. Then between 1776 and 79, a further 2,156 acres were disposed of by the British government through Governor Valentine Morris. This disposition of land ignored the boundaries of the 1773 settlement with the Garifuna and the Kalinago. Remember, after the First War, they had a settlement, they divided the place. But the British didn't intend. They were duplicitous. Because in 1764, they say all the land belonged to the British Crown. All they wanted to do is to put themselves in a position until they're strong enough to take it all. And they were selling the land. And so it went on and on. I have the details in this book called The Case for Caribbean Reparatory Justice. I wrote something in it. Even there's a large tract of land that Governor Morris granted to Lieutenant Colonel George Etherington in the northwest on the Leeward coast. He actually had fellas working the land when the French came, He had the soldiers. That's why the French took it so easily. Instead of men defending, they were walking Etherington land. It happened nowadays still, Fellas, rather than having prisoners doing things of use to the entire community, got them walking their own land. I'm not saying that happening under me. Nowadays, broadly it does happen. There's a fellow named Colonel Thomas Brown. He fought in the American War of Independence on the side of the British. And they gave him 6,000 acres of land, what they call Carib country land, stretching from the Byra River to the south, to Kyle River in the north, going up over what we call the Raboka. And confusion over it. People say, no, you shouldn't get so much, so he ended up with 1,600 acres because they started to fight among themselves for the land. And it's all there. Now, the land which we have, of course, since the there have been one or two little bits of land reform, 1897, in the Park area, Three Rivers area, land settlement down in the 1930s, after the 1930s uprising, on the leeward side. But when estate agriculture proved not to be viable in the era of modern capitalism, they sell out the land of small farmers. That's why you don't have any estate now in St. Vincent. So you really can't go and say, I want this piece. This is why when some Garifuna persons come here, like a fella came in not so long ago, as if he were a missionary. You know nothing about the history of St. Vincent, he just coming to make noise and splash for whatever purpose. But they have those too, you know. He's in Grand Sable, they have land up there. You say, well, they have land which Garifuna can come from Central America and all about to go up in Grand Sable and get the land. But the land was already in the hands of small farmers from St. Vincent. So you can't get it back. You're fighting the wrong people. You can't fight your own people. We had to go to the Europeans to get the compensation. And you got in the dollar compensation. We have to repair the legacy of underdevelopment, which is where the reparation is coming. And the story could be told about the genocide, and you'll hear a lot about that. I'm just talking land. Because a lot of people don't talk land. You know, when the British government forcibly transported Garifuna to Balliceaux, there's a fellow named Mr. Campbell, who was the owner of Balliceaux. For the 6 months or thereabouts that the Garifuna were there, they paid him in today's dollars, nearly $250,000 rent, you know. Collecting money, while half of the 5,000 of the Garifuna died. He collected money. In fact, the story is, and Camilo will talk about it tomorrow, he cheerfully, that's the adverb which was used, he cheerfully gave the place to the British government to keep them there, keep the Garifuna there. Now from 1899, the Lindleys own Balliceaux from 1899. Well, Balliceaux and Batavia. This is a brochure advertising it for sale. Balliceaux is 320 acres and it has 2 beaches, as we know. Batavia is 151 acres. The asking price is 27 million US. When I asked them about how much Balliceaux alone, they said between 20 and 22 million. Well, if you look at the map, you will see, and if you go there, you will see that Batavia is a beautiful bird sanctuary. You can't go and build anything on that. It is a fantastic, I think Doc Adams knows that, fantastic site for rare birds. And in between it, I think there's a place called Church Island or Church Rock. They don't claim that piece. So that's the government piece, as I understand it, from the chief surveyor. Now, in 2008, somebody paid a deposit on Balliceaux and Batavia. The sale didn't go through because the global economic meltdown came. And about a year ago, the global look as though some people were interested again. That is when I contacted you, Zoila, and I got the letter either from you or that about your approach to the problem, that your preference is if we can have it as a sacred site. A matter which we have to discuss and think about carefully. If you're going to buy Balliceaux for $20 million, because I could tell you in relation to Batavia, nobody could get development permission for it. You need a lot of money. And you'll have to put some infrastructure yourself. The question what we have to discuss is whether somebody wants to do an appropriate development there. And I understand our dear sister is going to be talking about how sacred lands can be used for economic opportunities rather than looking at it in either or terms. And whether, if a development comes, appropriate development, that it is possible to have at the same time a suitable remembrance. How many acres out of these? 320? Don't know. That is something which we'll have to talk about. And there's a lot of history. Not that you're selling yourself, but there's a lot of history where we can educate people. And we can see how all over, this country, there's a lot of history about Garifuna. Plenty spots when you study the history. Of course, for African peoples too, during slavery and since slavery. And other ethnic groups. Let us not forget that we are a veritable symphony with the fever of history has brought us to this point, and where there is dissonance here and there. The indentured laborers, Argyle is important territory for the Indians. There are parts of it for persons of Portuguese descent too. But we have to see it as though the symphony, where you have the metaphorically songs of the indigenous people and the melody of Europe and the rhythm of Africa and the chords of Asia and the homegrown lyrics of the Caribbean in some symphony. But as the declaration says, people of Garifuna descent have to play an important role into what happens at sites like these. Of course, the government can, in a high-handed fashion, just deal with it and say to the Garifuna people, go to hell. That's not the position of this government. And as you know, it will not be the position of this government. So we have an appreciation of what it means and what it represents. So rather than an either or, it may be possible to have a dialectical connection between them, but that way in which the Garifuna themselves the Ancestral rule. Many more things to be said, but we have to hear our dear sister. When I start to talk about this thing, I don't usually want done, but I have to done. Thank you very much, God bless you.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister. Please give him another round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, we will have another performance, and this time we want to invite to the stage our drummers, the Resistance Heartbeat drummers. We may need to drum up their table a little bit. So please welcome the drummers.
audacious attack on the roots and culture. Chatoyegan, Duvalegan, even some just born. They throw away we bravest daughters and sons, face their swords and guns. It was murder, torture, expulsion. Balliceaux, Balliceaux, a ball for soul when I hear how this story goes. Balliceaux, Balliceaux, a ball for soul for the rivers of blood that flow. Balliceaux, crime against humanity committed upon you. Balliceaux, the bones of your family buried upon you. Forget, you know, respect for sure. Make Balliceaux monumental to the Garifuna people. They try to hide the facts with lies in history. We expose the cracks. Listen to my story. We language gone, heritage gone, the bondage stayed on. Upon we, they take away my traditions, my birthright and land, plenty torture and forced migrations. Balliceaux, Balliceaux, a ball for soul when I hear how this story goes. Balliceaux, Balliceaux, a ball for soul for the rivers of blood that flow. Balliceaux, crime against humanity committed upon you. Balliceaux, the bones of your family buried upon you. Forget, you know, respect for sure. Make Balliceaux monumental to the Garifuna people. Get on the right track, reclaim the glory. Let us take back we pride and dignity. Sovereignty gone, family gone. You put me through times. Mentally, time to acknowledge your wrong. Pay compensations, reparations, reparations, reparations. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's give another round of applause. The Heartbeat Resistance Heartbeat drummers. Thank you for that rendition. It's now my pleasure to invite Chair of the Organizing Committee and Director of the Alliance Française, Vanessa de Mission, to introduce our special guest speaker for this evening. Vanessa, please welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Please allow me to adopt the protocol that has already been established. Dr. YANIQUE HUME is a lecturer in cultural studies at the University of the West Indies, KVL campus, where she specializes in the multidisciplinary field of Caribbean studies with a focus on Cuba and Haiti. She received her PhD in 2008 from Memorial University in comparative studies in culture, history, and theory. Her research and teaching areas include Afro-Atlantic religious cultures, the festive and sacred arts, cultural performance, popular culture, migration, and transnational identities. Dr. YANIQUE HUME is the co-editor of 2 critical volumes in the Caribbean intellectual tradition and is currently working on her book manuscript entitled Haiti in the Cuban Imaginary, Culture, Identity, and Performance of Diaspora, which examines the multiple meanings of Haiti in the Cuban context. Among her current projects also include a special issue with the Journal of African Religion on the aesthetic of death and an edited volume on the Caribbean mortuary complex, passages and afterworlds, which is due to be released in November 2018 by Duke University Press. Dr. Hume is the recipient of grants from the Social Science Research Council, the International Development Research Center, Ford Foundation, and the Wenner-Gren Foundation for Anthropological Research. Outside of her academic work, Dr. Hume is a professional dancer and choreographer who has worked with the National Dance Theatre Company of Jamaica and Danza Caribe of Cuba. She has also worked for the past 2 decades with Jamaican modern dance company La Cadco as both dancer and choreographer, and toured extensively across the Caribbean, Latin America, and Europe. This evening, she will address the topic Balliceaux, Heritage, Memory, and the Ancestral Legacy of Garifuna Identity. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. YANIQUE HUME.
That gets assembled. The Honorable Prime Minister St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dr. Ralph Gonsalves, Camilo Gonsalves, Minister of Finance, Sustainable Development, Economic and Information Technology, the Speaker of the House of Assembly, Mr. Jomo Thomas, members of the Diplomatic Corps, President of the Garifuna Heritage Foundation, Mr. David Williams, Kalunago and Indigenous chiefs, representatives of the broader Garifuna Nation, and other Indigenous leaders and elders from Guyana, Suriname, Dominica, and Belize, to my gracious hosts, Chair of the Conference Committee, Vanessa Denisian, Chair of the evening's proceedings, Mr. Ronnie Daniel, colleagues, friends, and esteemed guests, good evening. It is indeed a tremendous and humbling honor to stand before you and to the many who have gone before, who laid the foundation of this majestic land, to offer the keynote address at this 5th Annual International Garifuna Conference, organized around the theme of Balliceaux and its multiple meanings and possible trajectories. I wish to commence my reflective meditations with a call to remember, and I'll do this in the language of which I am, Yoruba. Omi tutu, ana tutu, tutu ile, tutu odun, tutu ekun, tutu ocha. Moyupa olofinololu moluban, moyupa olorolu ala saude, ala sunife, olurun alaye, olurun eleni, moyupa aseda, mayupa akoda, moyupa yedun, moniedun, modun ola, moyupa baba, moyupa yeye, moyupa ele, ibaye tunu, boboekun. I pay reverence to our ancestors, both the known and the unknown, to the spirits of this blessed land that enshrines its very landscape of the indigenous and African heritage, to the defiant leader Chatoye, and to the many Kalinago and Garifuna warriors who gave their life for the cause of freedom, I pay you homage in pouring libation to refresh and awaken your presence as I ask you to clear a pathway for me to offer my words. I stand this evening fully aware that it is through first recognizing and honoring the indomitable spirits of those that have come before that we can move towards fashioning a more just and inclusive future. Modipwe, Modipwe, Modipwe. I will be speaking essentially in two registers this evening. One is an anthropologist presenting an ethno-historical overview of a history that many probably know quite well. I'll try to edit as I go along. And then I will switch to a more applied sustainable development voice when I reflect on tourism policies and the potential for exploitation of a different tourism model. Balliceaux, heritage, memory, and the ancestral legacy of Garifuna identity, fashioning a model of diasporic tourism. The sea was rough that day. The water swelled with greater intensity as the boat drew closer to the desolate island in the distance. As the jagged edges of the hilly terrain became more pronounced, the emotions of those sharing in the moment grew even more palatable. Amidst the crashing of waves, silence befell those assembled, as though brought back to a time before this time. Some wandered off the vessel in a daze onto shore. Others stepped with great trepidation as the boat undulated, making finding ground difficult. Before long, the air filled with a deep, hollow, primal sound, one that was in part muffled by the sand, but also stirring up from the depths of deep sorrow. Outstretched in a fetal position, hand grasping the cold, damp sand, she wailed, screamed, and bawled, while others, with their tears flowing, understood her pain, for it was theirs as well. Not all made this historic journey to Balliceaux in the inaugural conference of March 2012, but the stories of those that journeyed across the choppy Caribbean Sea to the site of their beginning on the side of the Atlantic speaks to us several intersecting narratives that form part of my reflections today. Most notably, I'm interested in the manner in which these multiple crossings, spatial dislocations, and by extension, interconnected geographies of Garifuna identity and memory can be mobilized within the popular consciousness of intentions to shift the silences of the past. The history of the incredible formation of Afro-Indigenous subjectivities, while now receiving some attention, have been marred by the violence of the archive, the dominant narrative of extinction, as well as systematic suppression and erasure of the indigenous past from the public domain and popular imaginary. As a result, while the emotive saliency embedded in the word Yurome or homeland resonates as part of the foundation of the identity and collective memory for those who identify as Garifuna, the potentialities of mobilizing around such a concept have yet to be fully realized. However, the ancestral heritage and identity infused into the local terrain, the land, as our esteemed Prime Minister has indicated, is what I will argue is just the greatest resource Vincentians and the Garifuna people more globally have as they attempt to resurrect and reclaim the primacy of this once island reserve as not only being a site of freedom, but also a space where an alternative to the predominant imperial model was first realized. In my focus on Balliceaux as a specific site of trauma, or what Pierre Noir would call a lieu de mémoire, or a site of memory, I'm reminded of other such spaces on the African continent. In particular, Gorée Island off the mainland of Senegal comes to mind, the castles that served as transshipment points for scores of African people along coastal Ghana, most notably Elmina and Cape Coast, each of which display the infamous door of no return, also resonates with me. These four locales, situated in distinct spaces across the Atlantic basin, are tied together by the shared history of rupture and suffering spawned down by the cruel processes of imperial expansion. However, what separates Balliceaux from these other more notorious places is the fact that it is the symbolic site of ethnogenesis, or origin, for a clearly demarkable, definable ethnicity with a shared language, cosmology, and socio-historical formation. Furthermore, Balliceaux was an island with no physical structure erected by colonial authorities, but instead a barren, inhospitable terrain used to sequester those deemed a threat to the imperial master's vision of conquest and exploitation. Unlike the ports of Africa, where those that were assembled were captured from diverse territories, spoke different languages, maintained varying customs, and hailed from distinct ethnic backgrounds stretching along the west coast and central to southern Africa, Balliceaux was a land where Garinagu or Garifuna identity was inscribed into the very landscape. The fact that remains of over 2,500 of the original 5,000 or so prisoners are embedded in the land, and also speaks to the deeply tangible sacred roots of ancestral origin. Balliceaux, therefore, is not a random space or vestige of the past, or simply a place of genocide, but the actual physical repository of trauma, memory, roots, and more poignantly, beginnings. I say beginnings because for those who survived the regime of terror exacted against them and endured on the land that was believed would annihilate them, Balliceaux became that point of departure, which was to extend to further cultural evolutions and diasporic horizons. The question that arises from this knowledge is how best to honor and pay justice to this history in the now. Given that Garifuna communities are among the largest living examples of the survival of the indigenous past in the present, that is, as a population that crosses several historical constellations and geographies, what is the role that St. Vincent and Island of Balliceaux specifically could play in safeguarding the history and memorializing the past, while also affirming the defiance and existence of a vibrant Garifuna cultural present? Define the myth of extinction. Any understanding of the indigenous Caribbean present requires a bracketing of the myth of extinction that served as the master trope within Caribbean historiography. From the diaries of Columbus to the commentary of European sojourners, missionaries, and planters, from the larger islands of the north to the smaller windward islands of the eastern Caribbean, a familiar narrative of annihilation unfolds. The broad outlines of this history are well known, and there are those of cataclysm. Europeans arrived in the so-called New World and were very quickly destroyed the populous and thriving native worlds through a combination of military conquest, enslavement, and disease. The near and dramatic obliteration of many indigenous settlements in the Greater Antilles at the time of the arrival of European settlers has tended to overshadow the tremendous diversity in these communities and the varying historical development of Carib or Kalinago communities in South and Eastern Caribbean. My deliberate use of the more accurate name, Kalinago, even though the historical records that I reference prefer Carib, is an attempt to reclaim the power of the indigenous, the power of the indigenous name. The popular nomenclature at the time, yellow, red, or black Carib, were decisive labels to draw divisions between African, indigenous, and Afro-indigenous people. And while it's at times successful in its purpose of rendering these identities distinct, there was a lot more shared across these supposed and forced divides. The shared humanity of the people yoked to a tumultuous history of battling for self-actualization is a more unifying bond than the pigmentation of skin, or whether born in the Americas or transshipped from Africa. Notwithstanding the existence of Kalinago communities, 2 centuries after the first European landing, large-scale destruction of indigenous populations bore witness to an even more detrimental and pervasive erasure that has continued into our contemporary understanding of the region. Thus, we are forced to ask, how does one exercise agency or assert their presence when history proclaims him or her to be non-existent? The devastation most often invoked when speaking about European indigenous contacts in the Caribbean, while vital to our understanding of the history of the region, is only part of the story. Like other indigenous populations, those of the Caribbean have been subjected for centuries to narratives in which they are doomed, vanishing, always on the verge of becoming nothing more than a memory. And yet the indigenous Caribbean is still here, in communities who identify as such, as well as in many of the life ways and cultural practices of the region. They have been told they are vanishing for over 500 years, but have refused to do so. As testament, we have a full front row representative of this legacy and this presence. As historian Maximilien Forte reminds us, and I quote, "Concerted efforts enshrouding indigenous identities in an aura of primitivism, backwardness, ignorance, poverty, and even cannibalism would ensure that many modern prospective claimants to an indigenous identity would at least pause with the realization of the social stigma accompanying indigeneity in the Caribbean. In systematically denying such an identity, coupled with prevailing extinctionist narratives, have served to not only perpetuate the genocidal process, but have also displaced the rights to make claims to land, and in the case of St. Vincent, inhibit the mobilization of a viable mark of identity that is wedded to the land of ethnic origin itself. It is not accidental that for the enslaved Africans tied to the plantation economy of its eastern neighbor Barbados, St. Vincent represented a refuge, a space to chart a different path, and a land of relative freedom. It is in fact the drastically distinctive vision of land, its uses and symbolic significance as a site of sovereignty and agency that we see the traumatic European British battle with the Kalinago unfold. Indigenous peoples in the Caribbean developed very different social, economic, and political systems in varying parts of the Caribbean. While in the larger territories, indigenous communities practiced more large-scale agricultural production and had a more institutionalized social hierarchy, those in the Eastern Caribbean were organized into relatively smaller, mobile, and more egalitarian units centered around small-scale farming and fishing. The communities that settled there were extremely transient, and they carried on regular trade across the region and with South America, with which they likely had sustained interaction. The surrounding ocean, writes David Waters, acted as an aquatic highway, linking their islands and cultures, rather than as a water barrier separating them. Seems that we have to take a lesson from that history book. This mobility and access and use of the land was indicative to how Kalinago people identified as a community, not separate and apart from the environment that was central to their existence, a reality diametrically opposed to that which Europe represented. For Europeans, the region was considered free and up for grabs, available to the highest bidder. Thus, the right to land and the determination of its use in accordance with tradition, the cycles of the moon, the tides of the sea, and through the will of spirits and ancestors, was juxtaposed against a detached colonial policy of rapid expansion and exploitation. Land thus became the principal idiom over which the struggle for self-determination and conquest played itself out. What is striking in the history of European expansion in Kalinago territories is how long they were able, being the Kalinagos, to maintain this alternative social and economic structure in the face of increasing pressure and encroachment. They did so in part by making use of the European presence, trading for goods with passing ships, even collaborating at times with settlers, mastering the art of diplomacy, while also fighting fiercely to maintain control and autonomy, both over geographical space and their right to use it as they wished and saw fit. these people we call the Garinagu or Garifuna. The rugged mountainous terrain of St. Vincent and Dominica rendered these first, quote, Indian reservations of the Americas home to a heterogeneous group of refugees identified firstly by the Spanish as Carib. Over 2 centuries, however, these territories became home to not only those claiming indigenous status, but the abode of Maroons from neighboring Barbados and later the creolized Afro-Indigenous or Garifuna people. French missionary Father Laban describes St. Vincent as, and I quote, the center of the Carib Republic, and it became the center for a century of renewal and resistance to European colonialism. This is a critical mark of distinction and one in which needs to be harnessed for any social, cultural, or economical development scheme moving forward. And I'll say it again, that St. Vincent was dubbed the center of the Carib Republic. The population of the island had, by the late 17th century, 200 years experience of European and of keeping them at arm's length, European encroachment and keeping them at arm's length. During this same period, people of African descent were gradually incorporated into the indigenous communities in a process whose contours are difficult to reconstruct accurately. There are almost no archival traces of the process, but language provides a clue. The communities that came to be known as the Black Caribs of St. Vincent speak the Kalinago language, with very few, if any, traces of African language. This may have been because escaped enslaved Africans arrived slowly and in small numbers so that they had little choice but to adopt the Kalinago language. Even if there were at times larger group of Africans arriving in St. Vincent, they may have spoken many different languages. In this case, Carib would have served as a kind of common language, or lingua franca, a bit like Creole, or what Haitian became in Haiti. The Africans adopted, as a quote, and were adopted by, argues Johnson. So the Africans adopted and were adopted by, argues Johnson, the island Carib tongue, and also its religion. A linguistic study done centuries later among the descendants of the Black Carib in Honduras found this still to be largely true. They continue to speak a language very similar to that of the 17th century Kalinagos, with a significant number of loan words from French probably incorporated during the 18th century. This kind of focus on language became one of the kind of unifying force and reasons why UNESCO rallied behind this proclamation of this intangible heritage, this fear of the loss of language and what maintaining that would mean for the maintaining of this identity. But there was, however, one telling and powerful mark of the linguistic impact of Africans. The word for person, or persons, a keyword is the Bantu term mutu. The fact that the term for this word, a rather central one in any language, person, came from an African language, is a striking trace of the broader ways in which various cultures and languages interacted and created a new culture over the centuries on St. Vincent. What transpired in St. Vincent, largely unobserved and undocumented by European colonialists, was a remarkable process of cultural encounter and inter-ethnic mixing. Over the course of 2 centuries, African and indigenous Caribbean lifeways and visions shaped one another. The culture of the Kalinago itself was, by the early 17th century, shaped by interactions with European colonization, as people of African descent, whether from slave ships or escaping from nearby plantation islands, joined these communities. They brought a variety of experiences and forms of knowledge. Coastal Africans, notes Johnson, were likely to have been excellent builders of large canoes and would have found they had this in common with Kalinagos, who had long constructed canoes that could carry 50 or more people up and down the archipelago. The increase in the number of Caribs of visible African ancestry was accompanied by the French and British colonial articulation of a narrative that denied the Caribness of so-called Black Caribs. According to the narrative, the Black Caribs originated in a slave ship bound for Barbados that wrecked off the coast of St. Vincent. The St. Vincent Caribs rescued and in some accounts enslaved the Africans, but the blacks multiplied more rapidly than the yellow Caribs, and the two groups went to war. Major John Scott, appointed royal geographer for his expertise on the mainland of the Essequibo region, made first mention of the shipwreck in 1661 and gave the date as 1635. French missionary Sieur de la Beau repeated this date in 1674. Governor of St. Vincent, Valentin Morris, repeated the shipwreck story in 1777, but the date had changed to about 1712. He noted that the blacks, and I quote, so nearly extirpated the original possessors of the land that scarce 40 of them now remain alive. In 1795, Sir William Young, son of the British Land Commissioner in St. Vincent at the end of the 7 Years' War, gave the date of the shipwreck as 1675 in his account of the black chariots in the islands of St. Vincent. The shipwreck story established a legal fiction according to which black Caribs were really Maroons who had never been adopted into Carib society. St. Vincent's remaining Caribs endured further forced removal to the remote northeast of the country, where British authorities designated a small area for a reservation. The origins of St. Vincent's modern-day Carib territory. The St. Vincent Carib territory has never had anything approximating the same recognition from the colonial government as its counterpart in Dominica. The 17th and 18th century colonial insistence that blackness had destroyed St. Vincent's Carib heritage preconditioned the legal invisibility and impoverishment of the island's Carib territory. The Vincentian Carib territory absence from the legal landscape of indigenous rights is reflected in scholarly silence on its historical significance. Contemporary scholars Kenneth Hipple and Crimelin Ornelas invoke Thomas Atwood when they note that after the 1797 exile, the 20 or 30 families reported in Dominica were the only true Caribs remaining in the whole of the Caribbean region. Philip Boucher goes even further to state that there were very few pure Caribs by 1900s, perhaps 4 or 5 at St. Vincent, and rather more at Dominica. That the Garinagu or Garifuna emerged as a distinctive African indigenous identity in the belly of imperial encounter reflects a protracted history of cultural formation and indeed struggle. While the popular narratives tend to narrowly center around the fated 1635 shipwreck, closer analysis of the colonial records reveal a more layered and complex history of interethnic alliances, but also a history of movement, negotiations, and erasures. While what have developed as Garifuna identity was further honed in the coastal zones of Central America, most notably Honduras, Belize, parts of Nicaragua, Guatemala, and further afield to diaspora cities in the global north, such as Los Angeles and New York, Yoromim has been embedded in the history as a sacred place of origin. St. Vincent also remains a touchstone in Garifuna's spiritual life. Central to their practice are the work of what are called bouye, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct, or shaman, a character describing those who communicate with the spirits of ancestors. These spirits are understood as living in St. Vincent, and they have to travel across the waters to come to speak with the bouye. Sometimes, too, they are called to participate in large, multi-dimension ceremonies known as dugu, which are held when a particular family ancestor has shown their displeasure by causing sickness or misfortune. These rituals, write Virginia Kearns, center on mourning, the remembrance of the dead, and are occasions when the living and the dead enjoy themselves. It is a thrill when the ancestors appear, writes Nancy Gonzalez. People laugh, cry, dance, hug, and kiss, and generally behave as they would at a family reunion. These ceremonies are usually led by the women in a given family, and are an occasion that brings the family, including those who have migrated away from the villages, including to satellite diaspora communities in the United States, back together. The returning ancestors expect a feast, and a few days before the dugu begins, men and women go out into the coastal waters. They return at dawn of the third day, writes Kearns, with their catch, fish, conch, crabs, and other fruits of the sea, and the ceremony begins. The ancestors themselves are seen as making the same journey, arriving across the waters of St. Vincent. The altars of the Dugu and other ritual events often, according to Paul Johnson, have miniature hammocks, canoes, and sailing vessels on them. And during rituals, participants recapitulate and remember repose in St. Vincent by resting in hammocks. Our journey has been sad, my grandchild, the ancestors sing in one song. We have been searching for our grandchildren. We have been crossing the deep ocean for our descendants far away. With these words, the ancestors insist on connections across the generations, on the continuity that stretches back to the forests of St. Vincent and continues into a Garifuna future in Central America, New York, Los Angeles, and beyond. Recalling the names of one particular group of Caribs on St. Vincent, the Orayana, the song is a popular reminder, too, of the distance traveled, the losses of one shore, and the opening of another. We have been standing on the shore of Orayana, on the resplendent shore of Orayana, shedding tears. Historian and religious scholar Paul Christopher Johnson pointedly argues, and I quote, St. Vincent acquired the prestige of a place of origin and was transformed from a lived to an imagined place, a diasporic horizon of mythic status, and a standard to gauge the religious identity performed on the Central American coast. St. Vincent was marked as a place from which the ancestral spirits come. The work that we are therefore charged to do, in my view, involves a process of rehabilitating the primacy of this land, reinvigorating some of those primal rites of celebration and remembrance. What I'm proposing in an investment in terms of thinking through how we tie land, history, identity, and the sacred together is through a concept of diasporic tourism, diasporic/heritage. And I recognize, some kind of wince at the concept of tourism. But diasporic tourism focuses on trans-migrants whose socialization networks, values, and heritage links them to communities and kinship ties in their birth country or that of their ancestors, and who travel back to these communities primarily to reconnect with the people and the locale. I'm recalling this lady's hair presentation when offering greetings from the Garifuna community in Belize, this sense of St. Vincent being a kind of Mecca for the Garifuna community. An idea that one must travel there before actually making the journey to the other world, right? So it's like a rite of passage that one must go through. Tourism, while seen as a blessing for some and a curse for others, can become the central ground to which sequestered histories can enter into public discourse and debate. Through reimagining and branding specific locales as unique heritage sites that allows one to experience spaces in a more profound ways. Contemporary research on tourism and its shift in the across small island development states, as well as larger territories, speaks to the very idea of the experiential, that the sun, sea, and sand model of escape isn't holding or attracting visitors. And in fact, our ministries of tourism have failed in terms of reaching key target communities. We tend to have left out the diaspora. We tend to not cater to their needs and recognize that the ties to homeland isn't just existence for the first generation, but in fact extends beyond several generations, and it becomes a tool for teaching, a tool for relearning, a tool for reconnections. Interestingly, what Balliceaux lacks in terms of a built heritage, it it has in terms of mythology. But more importantly, the land as tangible resource. Now, most of what we have exploited in terms of heritage tourism is in fact not the history of the people who made this region their home, but in fact the history of the colonizers. You just have to take a stock, just think about all those spaces we identify as heritage sites. They tend to be actually built heritage spaces like forts. What else? This is where I move into a more dialogical mode. So you could throw out to me, so I know we're getting tired, we're getting hungry, it's a long night, but where are some of those spaces that we conceive of heritage tourism projects? Cannons? Yeah, right? Sorry? So there's these, and also the kind of plantation houses, right? So there's a way in which we continually prop up and filter our modern, progressive Caribbean lifestyles through the filtered lens of the great house, of the plantation house, right? So your trip to Jamaica isn't complete if you don't go to Rose Hall. Likewise, your trip to Barbados must include a visit to St. Nicholas Abbey. So there are spaces in which these sites become embroiled within the very understanding of those locales. But in order for Balliceaux to enter into another reckoning, it does require a systematic campaign of cultural renewal, branding of not solely a Garifuna homeland imaginary, but it must reach out to a broader indigenous Caribbean and actually going to those spaces, much like earlier, the earlier generations of Garifuna folk traveling the seaways, right? Rekindling those connections, making heritage trails that are in fact part of the marine the marine kind of satellites that Garifuna, Kalinago, generations of people have traversed, right? So rekindling those seaways. The very roots of Garifuna history is quite expansive, as I previously indicated, but the roots of remembrance is best captured in the Garifuna Settlement Day and reenactments. Before I get to that, I just want to, some of my work around heritage sites is also looking not only at the intangible history, but looking at specific sacred sites. These are just a list of what is identified within the UNESCO listing of sacred sites in the Caribbean. We see Belize. Cuba has 2 sites, Basilica Cobre, and as well as a Santuario Nacional. There's also the DR, which has, I believe, the most of the identified sacred sites, along with Haiti. So you have the Basilica Catedral Nuestra Señora de Alta Gracia. Actually, all 1, 2, 3, 4 of the sites within the Dominican Republic are churches built during the time of soon after Columbus's arrival. Haiti, you have several sites, and what's interesting about Haiti, and perhaps an example which a space like Balliceaux could, where St. Vincent could actually argue for a space of Balliceaux, is that not only does it include shrine spaces, which are inherently part of the landscape. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with the way in which Vodou ceremonies unfold, but the peristyle or the umfo, the temple space, is a fluid space. So you have a thatched roof, but the sides are open that pours out into the landscape. And Haiti as well has a waterfalls identified as a specific site. Now the conundrum that we find ourselves in terms of what do we rescue or resuscitate of Balliceaux is that it is barren. But its barrenness is also its potency. It's also its power, because it triggers that same level of longing, of loss. And the idea around diasporic tourism is that it operates around these poetics of nostalgia, it operates around this longing, these ideas of loss, what I think English doesn't really capture certain emotive things, it just doesn't quite do it, but we can think of the Brazilian saudade and what that means, even when it's uttered, saudade, that longing for something that is kind of in reach but not quite, right? That longing of reconnection. And when I started with the vignette that opened my discussion so far, this tonight, it was about how is that longing embodied. It is not a longing that is cerebral. It's a longing that takes on corporal dimensions. It is felt at the cellular level. And the thing about branding within this notion of a diasporic heritage tourism, it is to capitalize on that poetics of nostalgia. There are certain sites, I don't know if you may be familiar with this space. Anyone might know what the image represents? But before I get to that image, I want to turn quickly to the Garifuna Settlement Day reenactment, which commenced in 1941 and had been part of a kind of festival economy of Belize, but more importantly, it is the publicly recognized day that celebrates this population and their history. The question that this reenactment celebration brings up for me is what precludes developing events or a site for learning about the historical beginnings of the Garifuna in the land that is the place of its origins. It seems as though Garifuna history starts elsewhere in terms of what happens around how it's packaged, how it is imagined, how it is lived, how it is embodied. Erasure and social amnesia in this land, in Urumie, was almost complete. And we see, and I commend the efforts of the Garifuna Heritage Foundation in resuscitating that very history, but it cannot just exist within the space of dialogue. It has to exist in the space of experience. And experience that is curated. That's why I speak to, tourism, but also speaking to a way in which we could perhaps think through museum spaces. I spent some time, I worked prior to entering the academy at the Smithsonian. One of the wonderful experiences coming out of that was as a person growing up in a post-colony, museums I didn't think were a space for me to reflect on my history. It seemed so removed. The narrative seemed so outside of who I thought myself to be. In part because some of the traditional exhibiting practices were about erasing the history of the local population. But how kind of taking already the emotive power of the land of Balliceaux, and when we think about reparative justice, like what are we going to do with that money? Right? So we could get that money and invest it into something that makes more money. So it's not just about solving an issue in the moment, but investing that money into projects that could actually sustain livelihoods, sustain economies. I do wish to reflect momentarily on the need of mobilizing around diasporic affiliations and building a tourism project that specifically focused on branding a sacred heritage site. And that involves a not too difficult process. As we're reminded, the Garifuna culture, lifeways, have already been identified by UNESCO as part of the proclamation of intangible heritage of world cultures. But it takes then for the Garifuna community globally to push and ask for the deeming of Balliceaux as a sacred site of origin, and by extension, or I should say St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and specifically Balliceaux as that sacred site. And because of these conventions require, as part of the stipulations in Article 14, it requires a revisiting, a continual revisiting of what is identified as heritage and how you could then further market and expand on that which has already been identified as something of significance for world culture. I'm almost wrapping up. So building this tourism project specifically focuses on branding a sacred heritage site created in the mainland and also on Balliceaux, which would include an interactive museum, heritage trail, and a monument to Chateauguay. Maybe I'm missing it, but is there one? I remember, my first, second, third, this may be my fourth, searching, thinking I must have missed it, and asking, did we go past it? And I just didn't see it. And we have a history of creating monuments in the region. We love looking at dead people, but we don't like looking at ourselves. And so there must be a monument to Queen Victoria, to almost all of the isles that were once British owned. We have monuments to French leaders. We have monuments to Josephine without a head. We have monuments to Solitude. So we have, in places like Guadeloupe, a revisiting of that monumental history. And I caution against us just creating or erecting a bronze model that no one kind of deals with, like the one in Barbados that is a representative of emancipation, yet you're going around a roundabout, so you can't really contemplate it, right? And so how do we begin to anchor this history through these processes, and I'm not at all naive in thinking that money is just going to fall from the sky. These projects require serious money, serious investment. And so I draw my initial examples in terms of thinking through what did other spaces do. I draw my initial examples of developing roots of remembrances through promoting diaspora tourism at sites of trauma, through looking to Africa. And I return to that space in which those spaces I mentioned in the beginning, because I remember vividly the first time going on a boat, much like the first time going on a boat to go to Balliceaux. Those same emotive vibrations echoed in my first experience of going to Gorée Island. And it represents an interesting kind of parallel of leaving a mainland on a ferry and going through relatively treacherous waters to then get to this island. But the difference between Gorée and Balliceaux is that Gorée is lived on, it is inhabited, its culture is vibrant. And so there were things in which to sell and to model and to be able to experience. And it had the actual built structure of the dungeons. The power of the diaspora, however, for the development of African societies was not lost on independence leaders. From the late 1950s, countries such as Ghana recognized the power of the diasporas in energizing shared cultural connections, but also recognizing that inviting the diaspora back home could help to stimulate and resurrect economies, but also deeper cultural connections. In 1966, on the Leopold Senghor, there was the hosting of the Festival of Black Arts. This festival was followed by the grander Second World Black and Art Festival of the Arts and Culture, FESTAC, which was a festival held in Nigeria in 1977. Locating these festivals in Senegal in 1966, in Nigeria in 1977, positioned them as the self-designated homelands of the Black diaspora. What prohibits you and me from that type of festivalizing, of which indigenous cultures, not just Garifuna, but indigenous cultures from across the region centers around this rock in celebration of Garifuna identity? Remember, the first Festival of Black Arts, spearheaded by Senghor, followed on the heels of independence. They didn't have the means to make it happen, but they made it happen because the will was there. And we also got the buy-in from the diaspora. So what I'm saying is that we must find ways of really mobilizing around the diaspora economies that have formed in the global north, but also the interconnections of broader communities of Kalinago and indigenous history. I'm just going to quickly go through where we are here. Some of the stakeholders that are involved in diaspora tourism, we see that we have the enablers, the facilitators, and intermediaries, who are these diaspora tourists. So it's a complex matrix that I'm speaking of. It's not just something, that just happens by erecting a building. And the rationale, the idea of bolstering cultural confidence, strengthening the indigenous components, establishing further ties across those indigenous communities, enhancing the destination branding, making the product that we sell as tourism distinctive and experiential beyond sand, sea, sex, sun, and rum, right? Breaking away from commodity tourism and relying on being able to think about what it means to bring forth a new way of perceiving, protecting sacred sites. So I want to just close by returning to the idea that many indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations peoples maintain about land. Land holds memory. It vibrates like our cellular structure. The sand, the rocks, the stone, the earth, the trees, the wind that moves by it brings us back to that first being, that primal being. And it is about recognizing this, honoring this, memorializing, and finding a way to erect strategies whereby we can enhance a greater understanding, but also profit from the land itself. And thank you very much. I'm not sure whether there are questions or whether we're leaving or comments. Any comments or questions anyone may have? C'est bon? Well, have a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, you agree with me that this has been a most excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Hume. And it certainly sets the tone for tomorrow, well, for the rest of the evening, and certainly for tomorrow. And I recall my Haitian friends in Jamaica saying, "Bon zin zin," it is good stuff. And certainly Dr. Hume has given us some good stuff. I certainly want to thank her on your behalf and to invite our dear Sister Zola to bring this evening's proceedings to an end. Welcome, Sister Zola.
Good evening, everyone. It has been an awesome evening. And on behalf of the Garifuna Heritage Foundation, I really take great pleasure in thanking all who have participated in this evening's event. Firstly, I'd like to thank Dr. Leandro Ralph Gonzalez, our Honorable Prime Minister, for his very informative address. Thank you, as usual, Dr. Gonzalez. He has given only a tip of all the information that he could bring. I'd like to thank our guest speaker, our keynote, Dr. YANIQUE HUME, who graciously agreed to present and who did such a wonderful job in presenting it to us. Excellent initiatives or thoughts and ideas that will give us certainly many days of food for thought and planning and conceptualization. Thank you, Yan. This is Sandra Miranda. Thank you for doing the opening prayer, as well as the other delegate from Guyana who assisted her in giving our opening prayer and bringing blessings from the ancestors at both ends of the Americas, Central America and South America. Thank you. I must mention that we had a very interesting day with our brothers and sisters, indigenous brothers and sisters today. It was very rich, very wonderful, and certainly we were very energized in terms of connecting with our Kalinaga roots from Suriname. And so we certainly see where our South American connection in terms of the Garifuna are coming both from South America, and we have also our roots in the Orinoco Basin. I wish to thank also Miss Ulrika Game. She had to leave, she had another engagement, but her stirring rendition of the National Anthem of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in Garifuna, as Sandra attests, really made a blood run cold. It shows the power of the youth and what is possible. And I must say that her rendition is a product of the youth program which has been developed here over the past 5 years by Ms. Trish St. Hill and her team, who come every summer faithfully to develop Garifuna programs for the youth here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And that is an excellent example of the program. I wish to thank the visiting delegations from Dominica, Guyana, Suriname, and Belize, who are here participating with us and making this year's celebrations very, very special. Also, the La Gracia Dance Company, Maxine and her group, who have also been doing tremendous work in promoting heritage through dance. We wish to thank them as well. Their presentation was very wonderful. The Resistance Heartbeat drummers, our faithful drummers, their interpretation of drumming as the heart of our African beat. That is really, they really represent the African side of us, and we treasure them and will continue to appreciate their work. Thank you, Resistance Heartbeat. For those of you who have been here present, we thank you for your patience and also your attention. But particularly, we wish to thank those persons who graced us with your presence, members of the Diplomatic Corps, in particular Venezuela, Cuba, and the Republic of China and Taiwan. Thank you. Having said all that, I wish to extend our appreciation to those agencies and organizations and persons who assisted us in bringing this program to fruition. The Ministry of Tourism, Sports and Culture, the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Tourism Authority, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education. Thank you, those government agencies that helped us to do the work that we brought forward today. Our sponsors for this event, including the National Insurance Services, the Bank of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, National Properties Limited, GECU, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Teachers Cooperative Credit Union, CD Vera Limited, Gunsam Limited, the Royal St. Vincent and the Grenadines Police Force, the UWI Open Campus, and the Cobblestone Inn. We thank them all. Without them, this would not have been possible. And above all, I'd like to thank our gracious chairman for tonight, Mr. Ronnie Daniel, hailing from the UWI Open Campus. He did an excellent job, and we can always count on the support of our indigenous university, the UWI. I'm an alumni, so I always root for them. Thank you for your presence. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I hope to see you all here tomorrow at 8 o'clock sharp to register for our conference. Thank you, and have a wonderful evening.
Yeah.